Good morning. I'm Laura Tisdall. I'm from Viking, and I have the lucky job of introducing Deborah Harkness to you, the author of, I'm sure you all know, of the All Souls trilogy, the last book of which, The Book of Life, was published in 2014. So the publication this fall of Times Convert is pretty exciting for all of us. I count myself among Deb's rabid fans, and it's been a long time since we've had something new to obsess over. And while this book isn't officially part of the trilogy, we've been calling it a cousin. It will take you right back into the world of magic and history. It's also the first book that I've gotten to be the editor on, and I'll admit that when I took over this role, I was pretty nervous and intimidated. I am a fiction editor, which means I only edit fictional worlds. And while Deb's universe came from her brain, she is also a historian by trade. And I don't think I'm not positive I can tell the difference between an Edwardian armoire and a West Elm armoire. So I was a little nervous about being the lady with the red pen, checking off what felt true and what didn't. But what I quickly learned is that Deb's books come with an entire cast of characters behind them lifting it up. No matter what facet of the book we were discussing or trying to flesh out, Deb had a friend or a colleague that we could call to help make those details come to life. As Deb says, we have a historian for that at every phase. And it's been incredible to be welcomed into that family. It's an incredibly thrilling read, and I'm so excited we have it to share with you today, and Deb to tell us more about it. So without further ado, Deb Harkness.
Good morning, librarians. Thank you guys for coming out. I think this is my second library breakfast, so I'm really pleased to be here again. Thanks, Laura, for that. As Laura says, and as many of you know, I am the author of a set of books called the All Souls trilogy that began in a very unlikely way when I was on a family vacation in Puerto Vallarta in the rain and started wondering if vampires really existed, like the books all seem to say they did. What do they do for a living, and why don't I know any of them? Because I consider myself a reasonably observant person and felt sure that if my neighbor was in fact a vampire or was driving a motorcycle or any of the other things that they seem to be doing in popular literature, I would have noticed that fact. So that was really I have a set of books that actually began with a question, which is sort of in keeping with who I am in my day job, which is that I'm a professor of history, and specifically the history of early modern science at the University of Southern California, which is kind of a bizarre way of saying I'm a professor of world building. Right, because that's really what science is. Science is a way for us to understand the world and our place in it. So I just look at that over a very long swath of time. And when it came to writing this fictional world, I think I really kind of just was drawing on what I had learned over the years, trying to explain to my students why somebody in 2000 BC thought the world operated that way, or why somebody in the 11th century thought it operated a different way, and how those were all connected. So I got to do that most amazing of things, which is to create a fictional world for us all to kind of escape into and curl up in, that draws on things that seem familiar to us, things that seem strange to us, and hopefully give everybody a little bit of an escape. So it's been a total delight and a total shock that so many of you and so many of your readers have embraced my imaginary friends and my imaginary world as they have, and take it all so very seriously. One of my friends, when we talk about why, how has this book become popular and why has it become popular, and this whole series of books, what we like to think about is that the characters in these books, whether they're human or vampires or demons or witches, are basically monsters to think with. They address a lot of the things that we are facing in our lives, whether it's issues of diversity or acceptance or tolerance or trying to figure out who we are and again why we're here on on this planet. And sometimes it's a little bit easier when you're doing that through the eyes of an imaginary person as opposed to doing it within your own direct frame of reference. So I did take a break in 2014 after the Book of Life was published, and I think I needed that in a way, and I needed to figure out how I could re-enter this world, if in fact I was going to re-enter this world, because I never wanted to be just putting out more books in that use some of these characters, but I wanted to make sure that it still had a kind of purpose, that it had a thoughtful purpose, that they still provided that new world that you could imagine and think yourself into. And as I thought about that issue, because again, as a historian, I think all of my writing projects have to start with a question, not with an answer. I started thinking about, are you what you read? And I thought, the more I thought about that, the more I started thinking about my imaginary characters, some of whom have lived for a very long time, in terms of what might they have been reading at the crucial moment in their life when they found out that they were a person who had power, or they found out they were a person who was different, or they found out that they were going to live forever. What was essentially the story on their bedside table at that moment, and did that somehow shape their identity? So I'm talking to a room full of librarians. All of you know that we are what we read in a really deep and fundamental way. I am certainly the person, myself has been shaped by the voices that I've encountered through books, by the titles that I read, by the ideas of people who have very different ideas and experiences to my own. And so I started to think about this issue of like, okay, what is the bedside reading? And the more I thought about that, the more I became fascinated with using books as a way to get into the backstories of some of the characters that you had met in the All Souls trilogy. So Times Convert, the book that's coming out in September, is actually, the title is drawn from a line from Thomas Paine's Common Sense, that time makes more converts than reason. And I decided that of all the books in all the world, the book that would have been on the bedside table of my enlightened vampire, Marcus Whitmore, someone who was literally a child of the Enlightenment and became a vampire in the Enlightenment, would have been Thomas Paine's Common Sense. So Common Sense, the book itself, the text itself, plays an important role in sort of weaving through Marcus's story of transformation, his struggle to figure out how he is going to fit into a world that is still pretty medieval. He's got a good old-fashioned medieval father who was born in 500 AD and was reading a very different set of books than Thomas Paine, I assure you, or listening to them at least. And so it became a kind of, I think all of my books are in a way a love letter to books and libraries. But this one was really different and fresh because it wasn't a scientific book, but a political book. And it gave me the opportunity to read and reread and re-examine this text, this really important text that has been so central to who we imagine ourselves to be as Americans. And so that's where the sort of title Times Convert came from. But of course, Times Convert can take on all sorts of new meanings if you're thinking about the experience of someone who may not ever die and has got to get up every single morning and face a new day. So for all of us who were struggling with our early wake-up call this morning and thinking, oh my gosh, how are we going to get ourselves there? Imagine what it would be like to have that prospect stretching in front of you for not a year or 10 years, but thousands of years. What gets you up in the morning and keeps you going? I don't know. A lot of caffeine is partly my answer, but I think you have to have something else as well. And that's what I wanted to explore in this kissing cousin to the All Souls trilogy is sort of how do you keep going, and what are the kind of ideas and commitments that can make you a sort of an engaged and humane person, even if you are in fact a hundreds-year-old vampire. So, as all of you know who have read the books or who have recommended them to your readers, because I'm a historian, I like a lot of history in my books. So there is my attempt to really invoke the period of the 18th century, both in America, in France, and in England. So it's a kind of deep dive into a period that is not my area of specialization, but which I think looms, again, large in all of our sort of collective imaginations at this point in time. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what your clients, my readers, your readers, think about this new world and these new sort of angles on the past and reading. I have to say that as a historian and as a longtime lover of books, it always strikes me when I'm out on the road talking to my readers about how many of them are reliant on you and on what you do for their reading material. I think it's easy for us to think that everybody has the access and the ability to just buy a book if they like it and they want to read it. But I know differently, and you know differently. And I just want to thank you all for doing the work that you do to get books into the hands of readers who really need that exposure to a wider world and a wider set of perspectives. And so I just want to thank you for everything librarians have done for me, for my fans and readers out there. And I just want to ask you to keep doing what you're doing, because you're doing a great job. So thank you so much.